That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think our position as of today is overall unchanged from our position in February, whereby effectively we haven't seen everything we need to declare the plan sound. To date, since February we've been away and we've been in close contact with Brentwood today, and an assessment of the impacts upon the strategic network, so that is M25 junctions 28, 29 and the A12 junction 12, assessment has taken place. What it is indicating is that there's potentially a significant amount of mitigation required, not only at the roundabouts at junctions 28 and 29, but also at the mergers and diverges, and at the mergers and diverges at A12 junction 12. Now, although the assessments have been taken place and required mitigation at those locations has been identified, only some of that mitigation has been presented to us. It hasn't all been presented to us. And so we don't have the evidence that, the impacts can be mitigated because we haven't seen all of the mitigations yet. Once we've seen the mitigations, we could then, look at safety assessments, initial safety assessments to decide whether there would be any showstoppers which would prevent those being built from a design point of view, and costs. But obviously the safety assessments and the costs really have yet to be produced. So our position is from a soundness point of view that there's still insufficient evidence for us to declare the plan sound at this point.
Apologies. Ms. Burgess, is there anything you want to add to that? Because I'm going to go to I'm going to go to Brentwood County Council and then to Essex County Council. Oh.
There's nothing more I want to add at this time.
Okay. Thank you. I've just had a message through as well that we're now live on YouTube. Ms. Feeney, was that what you were going to say?
Yeah.
You're on mute, Ms. Feeney.
Thank you. Yes, we are now live on YouTube, and just to confirm that the full recording will be uploaded later for those who have not been able to hear the first part of the meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's good news. Thank you very much. Okay, can I come to Brentwood County Council, please? Brentwood Borough Council, please, to just give us just a short summary of the position of yourselves in relation to the outstanding objection that Highways England has on the matter.
I'm going to ask Mr. Ubacker, who's been involved in discussions, to give you our position on this.
Thank you. Mr. Ubacker, please.
Thank you, inspectors. We have worked closely with Highways England, and we have been undertaking and have delivered the majority of information that's required. Where we have, and our position is, we have mitigations to deal with the growth that's in Brentwood's local plan. What we have been asking questions on is the degree of mitigations that we need to show in terms of merge diverges and other safety issues, which I'll come back to in terms of level of detail, that's required to address background growth. And that background growth is strategic growth. There are strategic projects that are currently on the both junction 28 and 29, which Brentwood support. However, there is a disparity between the level of background growth that in some instances, particularly around the A12 and that joins into junction 28, we've been informed by our colleagues at Highways England that background growth alone makes the thing unsafe, and therefore any mitigation that we put on top would still be unsafe. And the question has bounced back forward and between us is, well, then we are dealing with an issue that's really about background growth being so large that it makes these things unsafe. How can we therefore come to an agreed position? So that is basically where we are. There's been an awful lot of work that's been done. It's difficult to then produce a more detailed work as has been requested until we come to that full understanding of the issues of who deals with background growth, which some of these strategic projects haven't dealt with.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Walkden, you've got your hand up.
Yes, saying just to add to what Mr. Ubach has just said, that there is, it appears, a problem with background growth within the Brentwood area on the strategic network. However, that is not the issue for the local plan. You know, for the local plan, all we're asking for is nil detriment mitigation for the local plan. We're not asking Brentwood to provide mitigation for any background growth.
Because that was going to be one of our questions. It's obviously there are existing issues, and
Yes.
the local plan growth is not there to mitigate existing issues.
Yes.
That it will mitigate any issues that that growth brings in. So you've just clarified that that's not that. So can you just confirm then, from your position, you're saying that you haven't got enough information then, or enough evidence to confirm whether the local plan growth can take it to the point where there is nil detriment? Is that what you're saying?
Well, the local plan growth itself triggers the need for mitigation. There are several places on the network whereby the network will be over capacity by the end of the plan period.
That's clear. That's clear. That's clearly set out in the evidence. Yes.
Yes, and the local plan is adding traffic onto a network which is over capacity. Now, at the mergers and divergers, for example, you're dealing with high-speed networks, so that is a safety issue because you'll just be adding traffic onto the back of a standing queue potentially, and there is a risk for shunts and other accidents. So, from a safety point of view, you know, there is a need to mitigate the plan.
So can I just, so the mitigation that's set out in the evidence that's within the plan and within the documents that are before us, are you saying that that's not good enough?
I'm saying that in terms of the transport assessment that you've probably got in front of you,
Yes,
that has been superseded in what has been done in the last few months. I don't think Brentwood have actually shared what they've done within the last few months, but that's up to them. What we need to see is nil detriment mitigation at a variety of locations, at a number of slips, junctions 28, 29 and A12 junction 12. Some of those we have seen, but some of them we haven't.
and is there a reason behind that as to why you haven't seen them? We're just trying to understand everybody's positions and then see if something is solvable or not, as the case may be. So from your perspective, is it because you've had those discussions but you haven't so far, because it hasn't been done yet, you haven't received that information, or you've asked and you haven't received that information? I'm just trying to understand from your perspective, and then I'll give obviously the council, and then I want to bring in the county council as well, an understanding of their perspective. But from your perspective, well, the information isn't there.
Yeah, yes, from my perspective is that the assessment was ongoing, and essentially I think we've run out of time.
I suppose that comes back to the point of if we'd have known that at the time when it was decided, we're not apportioning any blame to anybody at all, because that doesn't resolve anything. But we, as the inspectors who are obviously outside of the discussions that have been going on, we've had no inclusion in those whatsoever. We are just a little bit baffled as to why a deadline was set and it hasn't been met, because obviously we are trying to just deal with the plan, and we perfectly understand that detailed elements need to be discussed, but it's how far detailed matters need to be dealt with when we're just dealing with a strategic planning element. Detailed detailed parts can be dealt with at a planning application stage. So we're trying to understand how far you need to go, or how far the evidence needs to go to at least get to the point. You know that mitigation is necessary, and the council has set out in its evidence that mitigation is necessary. They've not said that otherwise. So, but it's how far the evidence goes. If I can just bring in, because I know I've got several hands up, I just want to bring in my colleague, then I'm going to bring in Mr. Ubaka, and then I do want to go to council because I haven't heard the council's position, and then we'll continue with the discussion. Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you. Mr. Walter, can I just ask you, from what you've said, can you just clarify, is the solution, as far as Highways England see it, then a design solution?
I would say that the answer to that is yes. First of all, we need to see transport modelling work undertaken, which then indicates whether mitigation is required or not. Then we undertake transport modelling work on potential mitigations to decide whether the mitigation is acceptable or not from a traffic flow point of view. Then we need enough confidence that those mitigations are actually deliverable. So they need to be designed to certain standards. Any showstoppers for the local plan need to be identified that, you know, downstream may prevent that from being built. So we need to identify those at this stage rather than 5 years down the line that, well, actually, you know, we can't deliver that mitigation and, you know, we need a new local plan. So design does need to come into it, yes. And then following that, you know, then there needs to be an indication of what the likely costs are going to be from a viability point of view. Because, you know, if there's no chance, no reasonable prospects of any mitigation being built because the funding is just not there, we haven't seen everything, then, you know, that needs to be identified at the present time. Sound. I mean, I'd like to just, what we need slightly different from what you said, Mum, about these things can be looked at a planning application stage, because from a transport point of view, we're looking at cumulative impacts of the whole plan. And if we look at these things from a planning application point of view, it may well indicate that each planning application individually may not have an impact, but the cumulative impacts of the plan may well be there. So then we could miss things, you know, in terms of required mitigation for the plan as a whole if we just look at things from a planning application stage. Slightly different from what you said, Mum, about these things can be looked at a planning application stage. Because
thank you, Mr. Walden. Yes, I'm fully aware of the cumulative impacts are very important. I suppose it's how far the design element needs to go before. That was what I was saying. Obviously, it has to be designed up to a certain point so that costings and viability and deliverability and who is expected to pay, because we've already had these discussions on some of the site allocations previously, where we've gone through and said, okay, well, what mitigation is necessary for this development, but also cumulatively to ensure that the infrastructure is in place, and that includes the strategic highway infrastructure. So we've already had those, or we've partially had some of those discussions at the site allocation stage, and we realise that it's not, you know, that things do need to be set out. That's why the IDP is so important, because if there are implications across the board for some substantial strategic highway infrastructure to be put in place, then that needs to be proportionately shared across the development that's proposed in accordance with the policies that are set out within the plan. And that's what we're trying to reach, that sort of agreement. But exactly how far the design element needs to go to reach that point across the board, that's what we're struggling with. So I hope you understand where I was coming from.
Yes.
I was saying about, because obviously cumulative impact is really, really important to consider. Can I bring in, sorry, Mr. Walden, did you want to say anything
further? Just to add to that, yes, we're not asking for, you know, finalised designs at this stage. We need to, progressed to a point whereby we know a design of a certain type will mitigate the impacts that are created. It doesn't have to be a detailed design, but we just have to have enough confidence in it to ensure that a design of this type can be constructed and can be implemented. So we're not asking for detailed designs, but we do need enough confidence for a local plan, because we recognise, you know, a variant of this design may well be built and not this actual design itself.
But Mr. Wharton, you've been having weekly meetings with the council, and so why, you know, why have we got to this point where, if it's simple to, information that's required, why are we now at this point, and still have got these matters unresolved and seeking clarification as to what's required?
Well, the assessment to date has been it's been an iterative process. The council have presented information, and you know, we've commented on it, and the assessment has been backwards and forwards a few times, and you know, that has eaten into the time available. And you know, essentially, from my point of view, the assessment was ongoing, and it's still ongoing. It is still incomplete as we speak today.
Thank you. I think both of us got some more questions. Well, we've got quite a few more questions, but Mr. Barker has had his hand up before me, actually. So I feel
Oh,
I need to give way to Mr. Barker.
That was my fault. I brought you in.
No,
Mr.
no,
Wharton,
it's
before
absolutely
Mr.
fine.
Barker,
It's only
but,
fine. But Mr. Barker,
you've been waiting very
Absolutely.
patiently, Mr. Barker. So please join the meeting.
Thank you, inspectors. Thank you, inspectors. I'm a very patient man, so it's required in these processes, and it has been required. We've been working diligently with all our highways partners, because, as you know, Brentwood isn't a highways authority. Therefore, we work with Essex County Council and work with Highways England. Can I just make sure that everybody understands where we are? We have done the modelling work. That modelling work suggested and in fact stated that mitigations are required at these junctions. I think it was somehow, I don't think they meant that, but saying the work hadn't been done. That work has been done and it has been submitted, although it's iterative. And those mitigations have been costed, all of them. So that is a stated position. Now, with regards to the delays, it must be stated, and I'm sure you're aware of this, that one of the first things we ran into is that we were given information by Highways England project teams for different projects, Lower Thames Crossing and Junction 28. And at the behest of Mr. Walden, on behalf of Highways England, he informed us that the information, the modelling information for Junction 28 was incorrect and didn't match up with the information from LTC. We therefore had to instruct our consultants to revise, not once, but twice, because the LTC data was then updated again, to revise all of the other junctions to match data flows so that we could get something that was consistent all the way through. So that caused a bit of the delay, because we obtained basically from two major projects different information that was pointed out by Highways England. Having done that, the resultant was that the background growth, which we will keep coming back to for the LTC, is of a significantly greater proportion than the Junction 28 background growth, because they modelled it differently. So in terms of the Brentwood growth, which I must emphasise at this point is minuscule, is very small with regards to the overall impacts, particularly of background growth, we were confident that we'd done sufficient work that's required for a local plan at this level to mitigate the impacts of our growth. But quite rightly, and I agree with Mr. Walden when he made this statement, the safety issues that occur because of this significant uplift in background growth caused by the LTC was such that even if we could mitigate our small amount of growth, the safety issue still arises. Therefore, we have a conversation when we say, well, okay, we are a local planning authority that knows we can mitigate our small amount of growth within all of these junctions where we have identified for our modelling that there is an issue. But what we can't do is ask the developments within our local plan to start paying for the significantly larger pieces of infrastructure that's required to deal with background growth. And therefore, can we have a conversation about where we stop our designs and our modelling and the high level risk assessment that deals with our nil detriment back to the reference case, i.e. when you've added on this background growth, and when we start having a bigger strategic conversation with our highways authorities about how we deal with stuff that's out with the purview of our local plan. And we felt, and we still do feel, that we'd reached the point, we'd given the designs, and we'd done enough assessments at this point to have that confirmation given to us so that then we could say, okay, well, based on that, here are the mergers and diverges that are required to deal with everything. Now, can we then have an adult conversation about who pays for what in the future? Because not all of that should be foisted upon the local plan of Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. Mr. Walkden, I'm still aware that I haven't brought the county council in to understand their position. So, Mr. Walkden, do you want to just respond, or what was it that you wanted to say? And then I do want to go straight to the county council.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. I disagree with what Mr. Ubaka said in terms of all the mitigation has been presented, because we haven't seen any mitigation for the Junction 28 mergers or diverges, for instance. And there is outstanding mitigation at Junction 29 as well, in terms of the mergers and diverges. Having said that, mitigation at the roundabouts themselves and some of the mergers and diverges at Junction 28, Junction 29 have been presented. I don't disagree with Mr. Ubaka in terms of the background growth. Yes, there is significant background growth on this part of the network, but in that sense, it doesn't make it different to the issues facing planning authorities around the M25 or elsewhere in the region. You know, there are lots of authorities, you know, that are having to deal with the consequences of the background growth and their nil detriment impacts on top of background growth. But yes, I mean, there is an underlying problem there. It will be there, you know, with or without Lower Thames Crossing itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Obviously, we will be coming back to these discussions, but if I can just bring in the county council, because I just want to understand their position and their involvement within this process. So, Mr. Robinson, is it going to be yourself?
It is. Thank you. Essex County Council have attended the regular meetings with Highways England and Brentwood Borough Council as well. Essentially, our position hasn't changed since the previous sessions. We've reviewed the modelling that's been done over the last few months. While we would appreciate a bit more clarity on certain matters of detail, we can't see any major showstoppers that would give us any new concerns with regard to the local highway network. There's appreciating that there is a bit of design work that still needs to be carried out that could deal with any outstanding issues of concern.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ubaka, you've got your hand up. Did you want to add? You're on mute, Mr. Ubaka.
Please, I'd flicked it to come off. Yes, Inspector, thank you. It was just to clarify, again, that was the point which I mentioned earlier that Mr. Walton just talked about. We recognise that some of the mergers and diverge drawings need to be done. Our point of concern is that we are now doing work and we're now proposing work within a local plan that goes beyond the purview of that local plan in terms of who will deliver it and pay for it. Now, this is the discussion. This is where we got to. So that you can say we ran out of time, but this has been a discussion. It's almost been a point of pause, really, where we have been quite rightly saying to Highways England, we understand your concerns about the mergers and diverges, and we're designing them. We want comfort and clarity that you're not going to expect the burden of cost of delivering these things to be apportioned to Brentwood Borough Council. because they are not caused by the very small amount of growth that is coming out of our local plan. They're just not, and I think it's unreasonable for any statutory authority to consider putting the burden of very large potential costs that don't directly come from growth within local plan on the local authority. It should be something that, you know, designs are drawn, we look at them and go, okay, you can draw a red line around that. And while we see that that will work in the future, and let's remember this is a worst case scenario, so we might never get there. While we, you know, we can draw it, but what we can't then do is start to put huge amounts of cost into an IDP that frankly aren't the direct result of Brentwood growth. There's something else, they're background growth.
So this is the impasse, basically.
Basically, yes, Inspector. That's the impasse. We, you know,
have any
once.
Sorry, no. What I was going to say was, have any potential solutions to this impasse been discussed at any of these meetings?
Yes, they have. We have looked at sustainable transport as we should under the NPPF. We looked at that first. But to be consistent with the guidance we've had from our Essex County colleagues, we have not over-egged the sustainability part because they have concerns about the viability of some of that. There are emerging policies and thoughts coming from Transport East, who we both of us will have to and do report up to in terms of what their bigger strategic aims will be within the next period, in fact, within the plan period. And so there are sustainability things that we know are coming forward from these larger strategic transport entities. And we have taken this as far as we can take it to a point where we have considered all these other options, and we are still considering them, and we're in conversations about how we can realistically apply them, because there has to be a realism about their application.
And what discussions, I will bring in my colleague shortly, what discussions have been had cross-boundary with other authorities, where obviously, because these junctions aren't just Brentwood, are they?
Indeed not. Sorry,
so
not
what discussions have happened there, either from the council's perspective or County Council or Highways England? You know, what's been going on from that perspective?
Well, we have had some great cooperation from Transport for London. They came on very quickly because obviously with the A127 and other roads that go into Greater London, they are aware of all of these issues, and we had some very frank conversation with them about the impacts on their road network. And they said to us, listen, when we get to the point where we need to get involved, we are more than happy to come into a bigger strategic conversation that looks at dealing with this large amount of growth. So the entities, and we're talking to the railway companies in terms of TfL and Crossrail, we're talking to C2C and Network Rail with regards to sustainable transport. We've been talking to our bus colleagues through County Council and others. So we have engaged with all the various stakeholders that can have a positive impact upon sort of, you know, impact on strategic road network and our own networks. And we're set up to have those larger conversations to make sure and monitor that if, and it is an if, the gravity model that's been used to do this assessment, which is a bit of a blunt tool, these problems do arise. We have a process by which we can collectively come together and find solutions in good time so that the strategic highway networks do not fall over.
Thank you, Mr. Ibaka. Mr. Warden.
Thank you. Can I just ask Mr. Warden that Mr. Ibaka said that that the council or the local plan, the IDP, did not want to be left with the burden of the cost of mitigating background growth or dealing with background growth. Is that Highways England's position as well? Are they? Do you agree with that principle that Mr. Barker has said?
Yes, there's no requirement for a local plan to provide betterment to mitigate the impacts of background growth. You know, we're simply looking for nil detriment solutions to impacts that we see from the evidence for the local plan.
Okay, thank you.
I suppose that's what I'm struggling with, though, because I'm hearing different aspects here. So if you can help us out, I'm trying to understand. The council is saying that the modelling has been done and the mitigation is set out. What I'm hearing from Highways England is that not all the modelling has been done. So is it clear as to exactly what modelling hasn't been carried out from Highways England perspective? And if it is necessary, why has the council not done it? Now, the council, I presume, is going to respond, and I will, obviously bring the council in. They will say, well, that's not necessary. So I'm trying to understand, what is it that's missing from mitigation of the local plan growth that's not already in our evidence? So is that Mr. Walkden?
Yes, I can answer that, ma'am.
Thank you.
The modelling work has been undertaken. What it is showing is that certain mitigations are required, and no designs for these mitigations have been progressed as far as we can see. So you can split the modelling into two aspects. One is looking at the mergers and diverges, and one is looking at the roundabouts. Now, the roundabout modelling at junctions 28 and 29 has been undertaken. It is showing certain impacts because of a variety of different scenarios, with and without a junction 28 improvement scheme, with and without Lower Thames crossing. So that modelling has been undertaken at the two roundabouts, and it is showing, what impacts are required, what impacts are likely to happen under the different scenarios. So at junction 29 is basically showing that there are going to be mitigations required. Those mitigations are likely to be able to cope with the impact of the local plan. That's not necessarily the case at junction 28, whereby it's looking as though the M28 improvement scheme itself will be required. Otherwise, quite large mitigations will be required on circulatory carriages, including the bridges. And in terms of the mergers and diverges, there are separate assessments. At junction 29, they have been undertaken and some mitigations have been proposed. I think there is one southbound diverge on the southbound off slip, which is still required. And at junction 28, we said, based upon the impacts of the merge and diverge assessments, we've laid out, what the mitigation requirements would be. And we haven't seen any designs which in response to our comments on the required mitigation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walkden. Can I have a council response on what Mr. Walkden has just said in terms of outstanding issues from Highway England's perspective? They consider, that those are outstanding. So, Mr. Ubaka.
Thank you, Inspector. Our position is the modelling work has been done, otherwise the merge, diverge, etc., and everything's been mentioned wouldn't be apparent, and therefore we wouldn't be proposing mitigations. So the modelling work is ostensibly complete. We recognise that there are some merge diverges that need to be proposed and designed out, and we're aware of those, and that's the stage we've reached. Again, to reiterate, and I don't want to sound like a scratched record, the conversations we were having was about who pays for these. So while we've instructed the consultants to look at the impacts of those merge diverges, we have a reasonable degree of confidence that the majority will sit within the highway boundaries, and therefore they'll be eminently deliverable. But it's, again, we're talking about a degree of cost that for a very small amount of growth in comparison to background growth is just unreasonable for us to produce drawings that then belong to Brentwood Borough Council that then could be suggested, well, it's your mitigation, surely you should pay for it. Now, And quite rightly, we take pause at that point and say, well, okay, no, we recognise these merger divergers are being done, but can we agree a process whereby even if we are paying for design work that is strategic design work to show that the mitigations that deal with both background growth and our small amount of Brentwood growth, this is what they look like. Is there a note that can be put on these drawings that says by another or by a mechanism which is to be agreed? Because it is unreasonable for any statutory authority to require a local council to pay for mitigations that ostensibly deal with background growth.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in my colleague, but there's going to be more questions. Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you. I think I understand it, and I don't think I do. I think that I think the Council and Highways England agreed, because it was in response to my earlier question, that the local plan or the borough council should not be paying for background growth. So mitigations in order to deal with background growth is not the responsibility of the council or the local plan. That's agreement, isn't it? That's an agreed position. So, so Mr. Barker has said that the council is worried about that, but Highways England are saying, really, you don't need to worry about that because we don't think you should need to pay for that. Is that correct? Is that the correct position between Highways England and Highways? Mr. Waters, is that?
I would say that yes, it is correct. You know, we are only asking for nil detriment mitigation. It may be the case that with the mergers and diverges that, you know, some betterment will result through the provision of nil detriment mitigation. And the reason for that is that when you are providing improvements to mergers and diverges, there are step change improvements which need to be made. So, for example, when you go from a simple merge, the next step change is for a parallel merge, and those step changes will accommodate not the exact amount of impact. You know, so a step change may accommodate a few hundred vehicles, whereby nil detriment only requires, say, 200 vehicles from an operational point of view. However, from a safety point of view, those step changes are required. So it may well be that from an operational point of view, you may need to provide a little bit extra capacity to provide nil detriment from a safety point of view.
Mr. Ubaka, please.
Thank you, Inspector. I agree with everything that's just been said, but when we get to the specifics of our situation, we were directly informed by Highways England that while we tried to get to nil detriment, these merge diverges needed to be shown. And they are disproportionate in size and cost, albeit they might be done by transition. They are disproportionate in size and cost to the minuscule amount of growth which Brentwood is putting onto the network. And we were told very clearly that no, while they accept that, because of the background growth causing a safety issue, they needed to see these things drawn. So we pause again and we say, well, if the background growth is causing a safety issue, what is the bigger strategic situation that brings that background growth to a point whereby our very small amount of growth that we're putting onto your highway network can show nil detriment? Because we're not allowed to show nil detriment in terms of modelling niceties at the moment, because the background growth already puts us into risk, which I fully understand and I appreciate from a Highways England point of view, but it puts us in a situation where we're saying, well, you're asking us to show nil detriment, which we'd like to, and we've done the design works to do that. There are the mergers, diverges, which we are working out in detail. However, we're not allowed to go to nil detriment because we're in a safety issue already. So how do we resolve that safety issue that's been foisted upon us? And we've not had an answer to that question.
Mr. Walkden, please.
Thank you. If the network is over capacity and it's high-speed network, there is likely to be an underlying safety issue. Yes, that is the case. For the local plan, what you need to demonstrate is that you're not making that safety issue worse. And that is the nil detriment that is required. Yes, you know, in an ideal world, you know, there would be funding for all problems all over the network, all over the country, and we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. However, you know, resources are scarce and funding for road improvements are prioritised across the country based upon need.
So if this growth wasn't being proposed, i.e. the Brentwood local plan wasn't coming forward, what would Highways England be doing to sort out the issues? Because the issues would still be there. So what would be the route that Highways England would go down to resolve those existing and future issues in relation to the background growth?
I think my colleague Mrs. Burgess is probably best placed to answer that.
Thank you, Mr. Walton. Miss Burgess, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, the route for future improvements and addressing some of those issues on the network would be through road investment, roads periods, which you'll be familiar with, ma'am. And we are going through at the moment the process of looking at new route strategies. So every part of our network has a route strategy, and within those route strategies, situations such as these merges, diverges at junctions are identified. And then, as has already been alluded to, I think by Mr. Walton, they are prioritised by the government, and then we are given a remit to deliver those improvements within those roads periods, as we are through roads periods 2 at the moment, and for example through the Junction 28 scheme that's just got finished its DCO examination. And when I come back to the route strategies, which is basically, you know, the route to that future roads investment programme, I have been encouraging the Brentwood Borough Council to play their part in the current consultation for the next iteration of those route strategies, and to work with their colleagues in the county to make sure that a case is put forward to voice their concerns, as any other stakeholder will do, to ensure that these issues are highlighted for the future.
Thank you. Mr. Ibaka, you had your hand up, but you've put it back down again. Was it something you wanted to add or not at this stage?
In principle, it's just to say, in principle, we have put forward the solutions that we feel are required for a local plan. They have been put forward. We accept they're being discussed, but the designs are there. I just wanted to make that clear for the record. We have put forward our solutions, and they are affordable within our local plan, and therefore it's viable. And just to reiterate, I mean, we're building on what Janice has just said. Other solutions will be possible. We would have to refer to our Essex colleagues with regard to the bigger strategic look at the A12 and the A127 and our representations for future funding. We are open to other solutions, and we've had detailed conversations with the current schemes at DCO, and we have been engaging with both schemes at DCO. However, we support them because the level of funding that has been made available to these schemes is producing solutions, although not the full solutions we would like, that we would welcome, because frankly, we need them now. We're talking about future, but some of these things are needed now, and therefore the Junction 28 scheme in particular, albeit it doesn't go the full distance that we would like, you know, it's there, and we would hope we can build on that in the future to make sure it becomes appropriate for the growth that not just Brentwood, but the whole of Essex County Council, Essex County and others are hoping to achieve in terms of government guidance.
Mr. Shadoravian, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. Can we just establish this at this stage? We're looking at solutions which are to be considered at plan level. And no one knows that better than you, Ma'am, and Mr. Warden. It will be very far-fetched to say that solutions are not deliverable. That there would be any impediment to the delivery of an acceptable scheme, both to the roundabouts and merge and diverges at both junctions 28 and 29. That would make the delivery of Brentwood's growth impossible or problematic, so as to draw any doubt as to the soundness of the plan in terms of its ability to deliver. And although some detailed design is yet to be forwarded to Highways England in relation to the merge and diverge solutions, it would be very far-fetched indeed to claim that any of those solutions would be impossible to achieve or be problematic. So I just want to get this level of understanding with Highways England that design solutions can be made and achieved in relation to both of those junctions in terms of the merge and diverge. To deal with this, as it were, at principle, at plan level. The question of how much of the cost of delivery of any ultimately approved scheme is concerned is obviously of concern to the Council, because depending upon the cost of those works and the extent to which they don't just, as it were, mitigate the impacts of the plan, but go much, much further, that's a matter that would need to be discussed in due course. But we've got to keep a sense of proportion here and a sense of perspective. We're talking about planned growth, which has a very, very limited impact on these junctions compared to the background growth, which has yet to be dealt with at a strategic level by government. Now, if this approach is being taken to Brentwood, it would apply to any other plan coming forward in the near future along the A12 or A13 corridors or the interior of the M25. And it seems to me that we can only take this debate so far as a council in trying to achieve a solution here. And we've done everything we can. But we ought to be assured that solutions are there to be found in principle. We have identified some. Other detailed designs could come forward. And you can be confident at plan level that solutions are there. We can cost, as it were, proportionately what our contribution ought to be towards those works. And we're happy to carry out the work which has already been identified in January. There may be scope to deliver a little more, I don't know. But it's very, very difficult at this moment in time for us to go much further than we have. We can provide some further design work on the merge and diverges if that's really essential. But I do question the extent to which, at plan level and in principle, we need to go down that route. Moreover, and let's look at this in the context of the delivery of development through the plan process. We're talking about staged interventions. We're talking about putting forward detailed designs now which may not be appropriate in 5, 10 or 15 years' time. We have no idea actually how appropriate they're going to be in the future. And one has to take into account also that the background growth will change over that period of time as well. And the models will have to be reviewed. and reviewed and reviewed. So all I'm saying is, for the purposes of the soundness of this plan, we need to keep a sense of perspective and proportion. We are not required to go into the level of detail that comes up with detailed designs at this stage, so long as we can be confident that design solutions can be found.
Thank you, Mr. Shadaravian. What I'd like to do is just take a quick break, because what I want to come back on is to see if there is a way that some form of solution or look at the options for resolving the outstanding objection from Highways England and look at that particular area. It could be that we need to go back into discussing some specifics, but I'd like to just move on to that area, because there's a divergence here, but we want to try and pull it into, is there a way of resolving it? So if we can come back and just have a short break of, if we can say come back at 11:15, it's 11 o'clock now, so come back at 15:15, give everybody a little bit of a comfort break, and come back and just consider what the options are to resolve the outstanding objection, then that would assist us in moving this meeting forward. Okay, so if you can all stay online, but switch your cameras and microphone off, and then we'll start back at 11:15. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
And the meeting goes live. Thank you.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for that. There's just a couple of points before we move on to looking at options to resolve sort of outstanding objections. Notice Ms. Burgess, if she's in the room.
Yeah, sorry, Mum.
That's okay. You mentioned about the DCO examination for Junction 28, that had been completed.
Yes.
Could you just explain what that means in terms of progression of that scheme? Could you just expand on that in terms of timetabling, etc.?
Yes, sure. So the DCO examination finished, I think, in May. So the inspectors are now retired to consider and write their report. I think that we would not expect to have anything, a decision on that, potentially the end of this year or early into the beginning of next year. And that's basically the situation with that DCO at this moment in time.
Okay, great, thank you. That's all I wanted to know. We weren't going to have a discussion on it because obviously that's a different examination. But thank you for that. That was just helpful to just have an update. Thank you. Okay. Another matter. My colleague just wants to has some further queries just on the soundness of the plan in relation to the issues that have been raised. So if I can bring my colleague in, Mr. Warden.
Thank you. Can I ask Highways England, because this, we're here today really primarily because Highways England is saying the plan is unsound, and that's what we started with this morning with Highways England saying that. Can I just explore what Highways England view that to be? On what basis is the plan sound, and in particular, if you can have regard to the test of soundness in the NPPF?
Yes, certainly. From a transport point of view, our concerns of soundness relate to capacity and safety. From a capacity point of view, the NPPF test says that if the residual impacts are severe, then it will be unsound. Now, so what we have to do is we have to look at whether a junction is at capacity, how much additional queuing and delay is added, and whether that impact is severe or not. From a safety point of view, it's slightly different. In this part of the world, we're mainly talking about high-speed network with the merges and diverges, and what we are concerned about is that if there is insufficient capacity at the end of the local plan or at intervening years up to that date, then there will be a potential for standing traffic on the main carriageway. And if you've got a situation whereby traffic has to go from 70 miles an hour to 0 on a very congested network, then there is a severe safety implication which is underlying, and the local plan itself will be adding to those safety problems. So it's a severe situation to start with in many respects from a safety point of view, and the situation will get worse unless mitigation is required for the local plan.
So in terms of the soundness test for examining the local plan set out in the framework, what is Highways England's, which of the tests of soundness is it that Highways England are saying means that the local plan is not sound? I understand the point about the issue about safety, but on which of the 4 tests set out in the framework is Highways England now saying the plan is not sound? Because they're saying the plan is not sound rather than individual allocations are not sound. That's not what Highways England is saying, is it? Highways England are not saying that an individual allocation means that there is a safety issue on a particular allocation. It is the cumulative position, and you are saying the plan is not sound.
Yes, that's right, because the assessment has looked at the cumulative impact of the plan as a whole. It's not looked at individual allocations, and so therefore, you know, it is overall the plan which has been assessed. It is the plan that is considered to be unsound.
But on which is it? Is it positively prepared? Is it justified? Is it effective, or is it inconsistent with national policy?
I would say that it's inconsistent with national policy from a capacity and a safety point of view, in terms of Circular 02 2013 and NPPF. So from a severity point of view for safety and capacity, it is inconsistent with national policy. Effectiveness, if you consider capacity and safety to be effective, then under the banner of effectiveness, then you could also make that argument.
And what was Highways England's position? Just remind me, when the plan was submitted.
Well, when the plan was submitted, you know, we take an open mind. You know, our view is that we will try and accommodate anything that we can, you know, subject to tests on capacity and safety.
So did Highways England consider the plan to be sound when it was submitted?
We have not seen any evidence or sufficient evidence to determine whether the plan is sound or not. That has been our response throughout the process. So from the submission of the plan, there was insufficient evidence from a transport assessment point of view. When the transport assessment evidence came along, and it was insufficient, and you know, we've been requesting evidence to demonstrate soundness ever since.
So on submission, you had an open mind, but now you're saying the plan is unsound.
Well, on submission, we hadn't seen the transport assessment evidence. That wasn't submitted until late last year, November, December time last year. You know, and until then, yes, we were happy to keep an open mind. And as I said, you know, any development that we can, we'll try and accommodate it on the network.
And what do you so your sound, let me just be totally clear then your soundness, as you say it, is soundness in respect of the examination of this plan as set out in national policy.
Yes,
that soundness relates to that. It's not a highway soundness, it's not a technical soundness, it is the soundness of the local plan, which Mrs. Wright and I are on the whole basis of examining this local plan.
Well, the highways and technical evidence forms part of that plan.
But individual parts of that may not be sound, but you are saying that the plan as a whole is unsound.
Well, it's yet to be shown to us that the plan is deliverable because we haven't seen acceptable mitigation. It may well be that, you know, without the demonstration that the impacts can be mitigated, that 5 years down the line, that when you try to implement any mitigations, they may not be implementable. And in that sense, how can the plan be sound?
But in terms of dealing with other local plans over a long period, by definition, aren't those matters, as Mr. Sharadavian had alluded to, ones that will be resolved through the period of the plan, rather than all being resolved before the plan is adopted?
The answer to that is that it could well be the case that is possible. However, what we are saying is that at present we haven't seen enough evidence that those planning applications can be progressed, for example, and that mitigation, if required, is implementable at a later date. We're simply stating that at the present time, the evidence is not there to demonstrate that it can be implemented at a later date.
And is Brentwood in an atypical position then in respect of how other local plans are dealt with?
Sorry, was that typical or atypical?
Atypical, because by their nature, as I've said, local plans would be looking to a long-term picture and would set down broad strategic direction and policies, and allocations or broad allocations, and all of the detail may not be known at that examination because they were dealing with a significant time period where matters may change and more evidence will come to light and more detailed design, etc., would be provided.
From our point of view, is it typical or atypical? I don't think that Brentwood's situation is that much different to any other planning authority's situation. Yes, they have some hurdles to overcome, but we're certainly not treating this in an inconsistent way as we would. It's the way we're treating that is consistent with the way we examine any other local plan.
And what would be, in terms of Highways England's position, if these matters were not resolved at this stage? What would be Highways England's position? What does that what does that mean?
Well, if the matters aren't resolved at this stage, under a situation, if the plan was adopted and the matters weren't resolved, then 5 or 10 years down the line, when mitigation is required to be implemented, it may well be that it's unviable. It just can't be implemented because the designs were not sufficiently worked up at a local plan examination stage to demonstrate that they could be delivered downstream.
So when you say it's unviable, you mean individual sites that might come forward through planning applications?
No, I mean the plan as a whole.
Right. So what would because if the plan is adopted with allocations and level of growth set out, then what would you mean by unviable? Is it particular development sites, because Highways England might require financial contributions from those sites at a planning application stage?
Well, that level of detail we don't know. Normally with a local plan, mitigation is required at some interim year, and you can get away with a certain amount of growth prior to that mitigation being implemented. At the present time, we've seen insufficient evidence of when mitigation is required, of which developments will pay for those mitigations, and so we just don't know is the answer to that. We haven't seen that evidence. We've seen some evidence of certain mitigations at certain years, but the picture is incomplete. So it's not in our gift to be able to say that some developments can go ahead and others can't, because the evidence to demonstrate that hasn't been presented to date.
Thank you. Mr. Barker has got his hand up, so I've got some further questions, but Mr. Barker.
Sorry, Inspector, I just wanted to come back on a point of clarification there. We have demonstrated in terms of the Brentwood growth, through very simple to understand diagrams when the various mitigations are required. Out with the various merge diverges, which are very big potential deliverables. We have clearly identified for Junction 28 and Junction 29 in those very simple diagrams that we showed previously at previous session, with ticks against percentage of growth within the plan when each of the mitigations would be required.
Thank you, Mr. Wharton.
Thank you. I fail to say that can be the case because it has been presented for the roundabouts at junctions 28 and junctions 29. The information itself was incomplete because, for example, at one of the junctions, after 10 years, you know, the growth would probably be permissible on Highways England's network, but not on Essex County Council's network, for instance. So therefore, you would need agreements of both highway authorities that an impact on one network was satisfactory in order for there to be no impact on another part of the network. I mean, the requirement for improvements at junction 28 merges and diverges wasn't known until about 1 month ago. So in terms of Brentwood actually sharing that evidence on when the merges and diverges at junction 28 are required, there's been no information presented to Highways England.
Mr. Barker.
Thank you, Inspector. Apologies, and I know you want to get to the rest of your questions, so I'll make this brief again for the point of clarification. With the agreed exception of the mergers and diverges, we have demonstrated through very simple to understand diagrams when the mitigations that we are proposing to deal with Brentwood specific growth will come forward, not in year basis, but in percentage of growth basis. So 25%, 75%, except 50%, 75%, etc. And we showed those diagrams previously in another session, and we're happy to share them again if that they haven't been understood by our learned colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Barker. So, Mr. Wharton and Ms. Burgess, is there anything that you've heard today that would alter your position or lead to a clarification of Highways England's position in respect of that soundness objection?
Well, I think that there seems to be an impasse between Brentwood and ourselves on what has been provided and what hasn't been provided. All I can say is that if the evidence does exist, then can it please be shared with us? But I mean, as Mr. Barker has said, you know, there is information that is still outstanding, for example, at junction 28. From what we know of the likely impact at junction 28, those impacts could be significant, and whether those impacts could be provided through developments within the local plan is questionable because we haven't seen the numbers. I mean, in some respects, I do sympathise with Brentwood in the situation that they're in. There is a great deal of background growth, but as I've said, it's not different to a lot of planning authorities around the country who are in a similar situation with background growth on the highway network. But their impacts themselves are not trivial. They may be small compared to background growth, but you know, on their own basis, you know, they are quite significant. So that's why we need to bottom this out and find the solutions that we need to see.
Mr. Barker.
Thank you, Inspector. I mean, the impasse you see is I don't think it's insurmountable personally. There are solutions. There are solutions which we will continue in good faith to work through. However, my learned colleague is right. I mean, Nigel's right. The potential solution to junction 28, if we want to mention that, through the modelling that we did, it demonstrates that an additional lane isn't required in the future. In fact, it's probably required now. There is a DCO that's just been passed, and it doesn't deal with that for good reason, because there's design constraints. However, it's now. It's not even background growth to a degree. It's now. So for us to have a reasoned conversation and to take this forward, there is a degree of proportionality and understanding that needs to be taken with regards to the true level of growth that Brentwood is putting onto this network. And I accept the fact that if something is in trouble, it's difficult to put more on. But we have a DCO project within Junction 28, and we have the Lower Thames Crossing that's dealing with a lot of issues now and into the future. And so the mechanism is there as far as Brentwood is concerned, working with our colleagues at Essex County Council to come up with proportionate solutions that allow growth to happen in a realistic way, given that these schemes are there. I mean, Mr. Walton referred to other local authorities. I don't know many local authorities that have two major DCO projects on its boundary at the same time going through. Yet they're not dealing with all the levels of growth which they know existed for reasons that we've been given. And while we can't do anything about them, we say, fine, given that these schemes are there and given that you know about this growth that isn't being dealt with in these schemes, can we have a reasonable way forward that allows us to work together in the future to deal with these issues of safety and capacity? Because in our opinion, that doesn't make our plan unsound. There is an unsoundness to a degree with regards to the level of mitigation that's been put forward in existing projects that have been funded. And we accept the constraints that on Highways England as a small Brentwood. How can we do otherwise? Because we need the changes that they're bringing. But one has to be proportionate with an understanding and a process of working that says, okay, there is a bit more we could do. There's a bit more you can do. Let's agree a process and how we deliver that. And that's our position. It's not, in our opinion, a matter of soundness of our plan, rather than there are issues on both sides of the table and we need to come together that are beyond the sort of responsibility of a local plan because it's way too detailed. We know there are solutions. We know there are options of solutions that are on the table. Yes, we know there are a few details that we need to work out to make everybody absolutely happy technically, but there are solutions. And at a local plan level, we aren't coming to you as inspectors saying we don't have any idea what the solutions are. I don't think any side has said we don't know what the solutions are. We know there are solutions. Yes, there is a concern whether they're deliverable, but that is part of the conversation that needs to take place going forward, because there are issues at a strategic level that are beyond the gift of Brentwood.
Thank you. Mr. Walton, is there anything you'd like to say in response to what Mr. Ubarka has said? I think your position still, well, is your position still that the plan would be, notwithstanding those discussions, those conversations, that detailed design work, more assessments of mitigation, etc., that need to carry on? But is your view that the plan is unsound and therefore should not be adopted?
I think on the evidence presented to date, we haven't seen enough to be able to declare that the plan is sound from our point of view. I mean, that as I've said a number of times, you know, that there are particular issues on this part of the network in terms of capacity. That there are two large transport schemes there, and it would appear that there will be residual capacity issues after those two schemes have been or are implemented. That appears to be inescapable. Whether solutions can be found or not, it may well be the case that they can, but you know, as of today, we can't agree that, you know, the evidence has been presented to suggest that the plan at the moment is sound.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Barker, you got your hand up. I don't know whether that was from before. It is now. Okay, before. Mrs. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. We just want to make it clear, we're going to move on to just have a discussion about options for potential resolutions of the outstanding objection, but we just wanted to make it clear that we are not accepting any further evidence except for what we're hearing today. We're not going to be accepting anything further. We will be making a decision on the plan based on what we hear this week, and that's it. So just to let you know that there is nothing further, unless something comes up in the sessions and we personally request it for the purposes of understanding it. We're not going to be accepting any further evidence because we need to make a decision on the plan based on the evidence that's before us, including the oral evidence that obviously we're hearing as well. So can we just move on, having very helpfully had that discussion on the soundness of the plan and Highways England's perspective on that. Can we look at some potential options? And I know that Ms. Feeney did circulate a draft suggested updated local plan review policy. And it's very much a draft, very sort of, rough at this stage. It's not something that, that we've been involved in terms of the wording or anything like that at all. So it's very much the council coming forward, because the council will be doing an early review. We've made that very clear. Or even we may call it an immediate review. We had those discussion about whether it should be an immediate or an early review. No matter what, because there are other outstanding issues such as unmet need and other issues. So the council is fully aware that they need to do an immediate or early review. And the council has helpfully put forward some wording where specific matters could be put into that review policy to tighten up the policy. It was never our intention to have a woolly review policy, thou shalt do a review and that's it, leave it at that. That was never going to be the case. We were very much going to always put in something very specific as to when the review should start, and then when the update or revision to the local plan, or whatever the full local plan, it depends on what the review comes out at as to whether the entire plan needs to be reviewed or whether it's a partial review. We would then put in a date of submission into that policy and make it very specific. We were always going to be going down that route anyway. So I know that policy has been, or that draft suggested policy by the council has been forwarded to yourselves. And obviously that does include a suggestion that specific matters, it would list specific matters that would need to be addressed by the review to make it very clear as to what would need to be addressed, such as meeting objectively assessed needs, so the unmet needs, etc. Any other issues that may come forward that we decide, subject to this plan sort of, moving forward, that we add. And as part of that, one element of that would be issues surrounding transport and highways issues and the particular concerns around A12 junction 12 and obviously the M25 junctions 28 and 29. How, what's the Highways England's thoughts on that as a potential option? Because it's just an option at this stage, and I would then like to consider whether there are any other options on moving forward. Could I just understand if you have any thoughts on this, just from Highways England's perspective, before I then move on and consider other participants in the room, their perspectives, your thoughts on whether this would sort of not overcome your objection, but assist in, subject to this happening, you would potentially be content to withdraw your objection, for instance. That's an option. But I need to understand from the Highways England's perspective whether you would be content to go down that route. So can you just explain to me your thoughts, if you have any, on that?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I mean, broadly, we are content with that proposal. Obviously, we've read the draft policy that was put forward by yourself through the programme officer, and also the one alternative wording submitted by Brentwood Borough Council. And yes, we would be happy to go down that route, but we would probably want to see that policy strengthened by an addition of a requirement for transport assessments to be submitted for any development within the plan that comes forward that could have the potential for impact on the strategic road network. So that would basically be our only addition to what has been suggested by Brentwood.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know whether you would want us to potentially draft something out and submit that, some wording through the programme officer for you to consider as an addition to that, the draft suggested by Brentwood.
How quickly could you get that done? I'm just thinking it would be useful to, it's not something, as I said, we're trying to resolve issues this week as far as we possibly can. And we have an outstanding matters issue, matters session on Thursday purely with the council to run through some key points that we want the council to take on board and to amend elements, etc. So is it something that you could come up with quite quickly to assist? Is it something that may...
an initial draft of that we could probably do. Would you want that submitted then tomorrow?
That's basically what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
It's as quickly as, you know, literally, you know, today, tomorrow would be marvellous.
I mean, because sorry, I was
because it would just be a draft, because at this stage, obviously, we haven't got to the point of full-on main modifications yet. But the closer we can get to understand what it is that you would like that would assist, obviously, it's something we need to discuss, because it's obviously then it would be open to consultation as part of you know, full main mods consultation, etc. But if you could provide some wording where you would which would give you an element of comfort that if that is in, and then if you could explain, because I just want clarification. You're saying that you're content with that as a way forward. Does that mean that with that way forward, you would be, you would no longer say that the plan is unsound? So you would withdraw that objection? We're trying to understand, is it obviously conditional upon that being in a policy within the plan? Are you saying that? Because you're saying you're content with that process, but I'm just trying to understand, what does that mean with your objection?
Can I just seek some clarification from Mr. Walton on that point? Thank you.
You can. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it would be sufficient for us at the present time to remove the objection. However, you know, the risk would be with Brentwood because it's their local plan. It would be then up to them to demonstrate that the plan is actually sound. So it's, in some ways, it is postponing a decision. However, the circumstances do change, and it may well be that a review going forward may well be favourable to Brentwood, rather than the process that they've had to undertake because of the tools available to them within the last couple of years. So, for instance, they do now have a model from the Lower Thames Crossing team, which they may be able to use fully, subject to confirmation. Similar authorities south of the river, for example, Dartwood and Bexley, have also been given models to use, and they are using them. I don't really see why Brentwood should be restricted in their use of the models if similar authorities south of the river are actually using similar models. So that will certainly help with an assessment. moving forward, you know, there is a situation with COVID and peak hour trips, which it may become possible to factor that, although at present it's not possible to factor that into any assessment because we don't have any certainty moving forward on what those impacts will be. But it's looking as though, you know, within 1 to 2 years, maybe those impacts can be factored in, and that may help with peak hour assessments, for instance. So yes, we are happy for the objection to be removed, but that doesn't mean that, you know, once the evidence is presented in future, the objection will not return.
Absolutely, and you obviously have that right to as things progress, as and when a review process happens, etc. You have every right to object to whatever then is put forward to you as part of the evidence, or you may support it. As you said, you don't know until that review process goes ahead. So thank you for that clarification. That's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. Other than going down the route of some specific wording within a local plan review policy, does anybody see any other potential options for resolving that particular the Highways England objection? Is there anything else that Highways England, for instance, had thought of yourself that might have resolved any particular objections?
The answer to that is not really, no. It wouldn't be possible, for example, for us to say that, you know, a proportion of the plan would be acceptable, because apart from current planning consents, it hasn't been demonstrated to us that, for example, you can get away with 5 years growth because it's not going to have an impact on our network. But that's not to say that evidence couldn't be produced. It could probably be produced within the next few weeks to demonstrate that 5 years of growth would be acceptable. We just haven't seen that evidence. So as of today, we are not able to say a proportion of the growth could be accommodated within X number of years, for example, or we haven't seen any evidence to demonstrate that, for example, we could get away with 10 years of growth on our network, and it's the last 5 years that the mitigation is required.
Okay, thank you. Does the council wish to respond on anything that they've just heard?
If I may, Ma'am, the latest draft which you have is something I did by way of amendment to the draft you helpfully circulated. And I'm very happy to include any further wording that would be appropriate in that policy, and very happy to discuss it with Ms. Burgess. So I make that offer now. The other thing is, we need to remember, we're awaiting, this is about the policy approach, this review policy. We are awaiting the outcome of 2 major DCOs, one of which is a long way off yet, in terms of the Lower Thames Crossing, and Junction 28, which hopefully will be next year. The outcome of those processes is very important, actually, to the way in which one approaches mitigation at these junctions, for obvious reasons. So we have an unknown outcome in relation to those 2. In terms of timing, it's the growth in the local plan is going to be underway before those projects even get signed off for the purposes of commission. Long way ahead. The imperative for local planning authorities to get a plan in place to facilitate growth and provide much needed housing is so important that not to have one in place will have repercussions, not only for housing delivery, but also for the way in which housing delivery occurs. And it should be of much greater concern to Highways England that major proposals will come forward, as it were, outside the parameters of the plan, because there is no plan, which is up to date, through which it may not be possible, actually, to require those contributions to strategic infrastructure to be made. So Highways England may find itself in a much worse position than it would be in coming to a decision now to accept that design solutions are possible and to accept the fact that as a matter of common sense, these design solutions are going to have to be staged over the period of the plan. But to suggest that the first few years of growth should not occur without interventions, I think is overstating it. So it would be entirely appropriate in my submission for this to proceed on the basis of a commitment to an early review that provides a suitable framework for these strategic highways issues to be considered in the context of not only the growth which is being promoted through this plan, but also the additional growth which will ensue through the review, which is, of course, extremely important from Highways England's point of view. So whatever conclusion one makes about the adequacy of the solutions being promoted at this stage, they are bound to change, and bound to change pretty quickly as part of that review process to accommodate the further growth, to take into account the changing circumstances in the provision by government of much needed highways, strategic highways projects, and to take into account any changes in background growth over that period of time. So it seems to me entirely logical to proceed on this basis.
Thank you, Mr. Shadaravian. If I could then task Ms. Burgess, and if you can come up with your wording as soon as possible, if you can work jointly with, if at all possible, with the council to come up with some agreed wording that you're both content with, that would be really useful. And if we could have that by preferably now, but I'll give you a little bit of time to work it up. If we could have it by tomorrow at the latest, that would be really, really helpful.
Very good.
And you know, thank you very much for obviously making that offer to assist with that wording. What I was going to do as well, sorry, I've just got Mr. Robinson, you've put your hand up, just bear with me. If you can also include the county council in on that, because obviously there could be impacts on the local network as well. Mr. Robinson, is there anything you want to add to the discussions?
Yeah, as we indicated, we'd be in agreement in principle to the early review policy. But having reviewed the draft, we would like to see, given the importance attached to sustainable transport information and interventions in the transport evidence, we'd like to see specific reference to sustainable transport in that policy. And also, as I think has already been inferred, that there are some larger applications waiting to come forward. So if the review could happen as soon as possible, that would be advantageous.
Yeah, we will be deciding. It's something we will discuss probably as part of outstanding matters, the logistics of timing, etc., because it would be a quick review. It would need to be, but obviously we need to take on board political sort of timescales in order to understand from Brentwood's perspective what, how long it takes to do certain things. But it would be shorter than 5 years, let's just say that, because it would need to be, it has to be. So exactly what the submission date would be, as a requirement. That's something I know what I would like in there, but it's something, and me, myself and my colleague, we know what we would like, but we will discuss that on Thursday with the council in terms of the deliverability of that. Okay, so thank you for that, Mr. Robinson. That's something that obviously the council can take on board as part of that policy, local plan review policy suggestion. So thank you for that. Anything further on agenda item 3 then, the options to resolve objections? Well, I think we've come to a potential solution or resolution there. Are there any further points in relation to transport from, in terms of this focused discussion, that anybody wants to raise that hasn't been talked about yet? Because we just then want to move on to the commitments to joint working. We know that there is a commitment there between the 3 organisations to continue this joint working. I just wondered whether there was any form of written agreement about the joint, whether there was a memorandum of understanding or some form of just written agreement about this continued joint commitment, because sometimes having that commitment that can be made at officer level or even at the political level to ensure that there is continued engagement and working together to try and resolve some of the outstanding issues that Highways England has got. Obviously, this local plan review policy, if it goes into the plan and we move forward on the plan, it doesn't stop those conversations. So we just want to understand that there is going to be a guarantee of a continued commitment to that joint working, because it has to keep going. It has to just keep moving on. So I didn't know whether there are any mechanisms in place that made it a bit more formalised, or whether it is very much the goodwill of each of the participants that these conversations are happening. So, Mr. Shadoravian.
Well, Ma'am, it is a matter of goodwill. We are all creatures of statute, and we have responsibilities to the general public and to each other. So that although there is no formal mechanism in place, I think first and foremost, you can assume that each of the authorities concerned here, Essex, Highways England and Brentwood, will discharge its duties responsibly and will continue with that engagement. In that behalf, I think there is no harm in having a short statement of intent to that effect if the other parties are willing to enter into that and sign it along with us. And we could provide that in due course.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments?
Just from Highways England's point of view, yes, of course, we're more than happy to continue with the engagement. And whilst you're aware that we have been having twice weekly meetings with Brentwood, one of those meetings has also been attended by the County Council as well. So they've been fully engaged with that ongoing collaboration.
And is it proposed that that ongoing sort of, twice weekly sort of timescale would continue, or would it be dependent upon exactly what work was required and what discussions were needed to be had?
I think probably Mr. Quilter would be best placed to answer that. For me, I would suggest that we continue as we have been in the short term, and then maybe we come to agreement as work progresses about the frequency that we need to meet.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add, Mr. Quilter?
No, and I would agree with Mr. Burgess on that one. Yeah, and in terms of we're happy to continue that commitment as well. And I think at the key milestones which we can work towards, we can then review that position and decide on the appropriate timeframes to continue those discussions as appropriate. So yes.
Thank you. Mr. Warden, do you have any further questions? We're coming to the end of the agenda now. Well, we have come to the end of the agenda. anything further? Any other questions you want to ask?
No, I don't have any questions. I just make a point that in looking at the additional wording that might go into that potential review policy, just have regard to existing wording within the local plan policies as it stands, because it is possible, and I just say it is possible, that what you might be seeking might be there in part anyway on some of the strategic allocations, if that's the concern. So and also I presume that is mainly the strategic issues that are of concern. So just have regard to the other policies in local plan when you finalise your wording that you're going to put back to us. And I don't have any further questions. Thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Okay, thank you. Yes, no, that was a very good point. The review doesn't stop other matters being brought forward. What we want to make sure is that key elements are not, that are outstanding, such as meeting, you know, the objectively assessed needs, etc., and the outstanding issues around highways are considered as part of the review. They must be considered as part of the review. It doesn't stop other elements being considered at all as part of the review. So yes, we do want it to be a very tight policy, potential policy, should again we move forward. No decision on that has been absolutely made yet. On that basis then, unless anything if anybody has anything further to add, then please say so now.
Could I?
Mr. Warden, sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Wright, I was just going to say, just before we conclude, we ought to just give last chance for a comment, which I think you come into in respect of the council to the council. Yeah. Just to conclude on what the council might wish to make at the end of the meeting. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, first of all, I was just going to ask if there is anything anybody else wanted to add, and then I was obviously going to come to the council as the end because it's the council's plan. So whether the council had anything further they wanted to add to what we've heard today. So is there anybody else at the moment got anything further that Highways England or the County Council wants to add to anything that we've heard? No. Okay. Final say then to the council, the Borough Council. Anything you want to add?
I don't think there's anything I need to add, ma'am, other than to say that what we've heard today doesn't signify in any way, shape or form that the plan as a whole is unsound. I would welcome Ms. Burgess's contribution. If I could have something from her this afternoon, if it's sent to Mr. Quilter in first instance, that would be very, very helpful. And also circulated to Mr. Robinson as well. So I can have Mr. Robinson's feedback. And then I'll attempt to get something drafted up this afternoon and circulated in time for tomorrow.
Lovely. That'd be really helpful.
Okay. So far as Mr. Warden's comments about existing policies and allocations, I quite clearly understand the point he's making there, not least because, of course, interventions are identified in those policies. And they affect the way in which those allocations can come forward. And so they will need to be kept under review as well in the context of any review because of the cumulative impacts of development.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But again, just to reiterate, the local plan review policy, we only want the key elements. It's not to be a long list of what needs to be reviewed, because there will be consequential changes if it will just happen organically.
Indeed,
to be fair.
Absolutely.
So we just want the key points, and our key points at the moment is about the unmet need or the objectively assessed needs, subject to that being reviewed, and obviously the transport issues.
Yep,
that would be it at this stage.
That's understood. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you. On that basis, I would really like to thank everybody for their contributions today. It's been really, really helpful for ourselves, for myself and my colleague, to understand what the concerns were and what the and that the concerns are still there, and what the actual outstanding issues are, and everybody's perspectives on that, and the discussion about a potential resolution through potential additional wording to a local plan review policy. So really appreciate your input and your time on this. We do have obviously matter 12A tomorrow, which would be discussing purely highway matters, because obviously we dealt with other issues. I'm not proposing to repeat anything. There are obviously other participants in the room tomorrow who I would imagine are either watching this now or will be watching it later when it goes on, the full extent of it goes on. But I'm not proposing to have a discussion. We're not going to be going over what's been discussed in any great detail. Obviously, participants will have an opportunity to respond to anything that they've heard today, and will have an opportunity to obviously have their say then. Okay, so thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll see you, well, whoever's involved in the meeting tomorrow, we'll see you at 9:30. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.